Okay, and we're broadcasting. Welcome to Medcan Presents, the twice-a-week webinar series that happens every Tuesday and Thursday at 12:30 p.m. with employer-focused Safe at Work system webinars on Tuesdays and wellness-focused webinars on Thursdays. Today's webinar is Return to the Workplace, Checklist Considerations for Employers with Andrew Zimakas and Dr. Peter Nord. My name is Christopher Shulgan. I'm part of the team that creates content at Medcan. We'll provide brief bios for Andrew Zimakas and Dr. Peter Nord, and then we'll move on to a pandemic update. We'll take questions toward the end of the webinar. Andrew Zimakas is Medcan's Chief Product and Business Development Officer, and Dr. Peter Nord is Medcan's Chief Medical Officer. How are you, gentlemen?
Yeah, doing good, Chris.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris.
Well, that's great. I think this is going to be a great webinar. So why don't we hand it off to Dr. Peter Nord? You can provide a pandemic update, and then we'll hand it off to Andrew after that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Well, another dynamic week. Every week that we've been doing webinars since, well, actually we started in February, there's always been something to talk about. There's never a dull moment, and things change hour to hour. And here in Ontario, last Thursday was a bit of a watershed point for sure in terms of opening up the beginning of the return to work as a province, and really the phase one approach from the Ontario government that now everybody is kind of falling in line with. So a couple of big points. The curves are flattening. There's no question we're winning this game. I think a bit surprising for almost anybody that was going into this, whether you're on the optimistic side or the pessimistic side. I think everyone has been pleasantly surprised generally how things are going. And again, the curve really, as we've said before, is to create capacity in hospitals so that we're not going to overwhelm ICU beds, that we're not going to overwhelm ventilators. And that just thankfully hasn't happened. We obviously have still a significant number of deaths happening in long-term care homes, retirement homes. As we expected, that really older, frail population are the folks that aren't doing so well. If you take out those deaths, generally we're doing very well. The death rate is dropping in the community. As a couple of days ago, we were seeing, as hundreds of new positive cases. That's down now less than 200 cases a day, still going up. So, it's not going down. There's still more positive cases, but we are seeing many more people now recovered, and the ICU rate, that capacity is totally safe at this point. We still are seeing hospitalizations sort of holding, but the people that are admitted to the hospital now aren't requiring as much ICU support or thankfully ventilator support. And as per testing, the Premier announced 4 weeks ago that the goal was 13,000 per day in Ontario. And we've had a couple of days now that those numbers have reached 17,000. So we are getting the message out that the testing is happening. And a big change over the last week is that people can be tested even with very mild or no symptoms if they're concerned. So that's a pretty big policy change. And what it means is that we have the capacity now that we didn't have earlier in terms of testing. And that's that PCR testing that shows whether there's virus positive or virus negative in a person's system. So the information that we're going to start to collect in the go forward is going to be even more robust than we've been able to gather in the past, when we were really testing people that had relatively significant symptoms. And now again, with being able to test people with milder symptoms, it really opens up a whole new world of data collection and epidemiology that we can then turn into, again, reducing the risk, which ultimately allows us to get back to business with and obviously incorporating safety measures such as physical distancing, hand hygiene, all the things we've been talking about. But it does open us up to walk forward into the new world of restarting the Canadian economy with a real degree of confidence at this point. So that's sort of the curves flattening, testing expanding. There's your two big headlines from the last week.
Thanks, Peter. I'll pick it up from there. As Peter mentioned, government regulations are also changing and economies are beginning to open up. And obviously it's at a different stage depending on the region. Here in Ontario, where we're located, today marks the first day of a phased opening with stores with storefront entrances among the many businesses that are allowed to open, in addition to such things as golf courses, tennis courts, and off-leash dog parks. And in addition to that, the province has released 95 safety guidelines for businesses, including office spaces and restaurants, and a number of industries, including the auto sector. And many other provinces and states have similar constructs today. Meanwhile, many employers are moving back to transitioning towards employees returning to the physical workplace, and obviously that also depends on circumstances, the region, and of course the industry. A few examples in terms of clients that Medcan works with. Professional services firms like law firms have told us that they'll accommodate a voluntary return of many of their employees, but several others would prefer to work virtually, and they're going to accommodate that. We also work with a number of large financial institutions who've had people at the physical workplace all along, including contact centers and trading floors, for example, but they're starting to bring back an additional group of their employee population on a phased basis. And then finally, we're working with some manufacturing and food service companies who've had employees on site throughout the pandemic, but their operations need to continually adjust as it plays out. And in terms of Medcan ourselves, we're navigating these issues as well as we transition back to our physical location, which has been open all along for certain services, but now we're starting to expand that. And we're eating our own cooking, so to speak, by implementing our Safe at Work system internally and transferring those learnings to our client companies as well. So with that, why don't we talk a little bit about the checklist in terms of what our overall approach is. And I'll start with the first item, which is really to assess what the optimal balance is between on-site and at-home work. So let me talk about that a little bit. So the first thing is that you need to look at every functional area of the enterprise in this context, in this new normal context, to evaluate that. In some cases, this may be in the context of significant operational changes that the business has undergone through the pandemic, and possibly even an entirely new business model for some companies as well. It may require reassessment of a value proposition, client segmentation, supply chain stability, or even the strategic plan. And as an example for Medcan, we've accelerated the delivery of our virtual and in-home services throughout the pandemic. But this is going to remain a core part of our business model and requires a different approach, including on the people side going forward. Beyond that, assessing the varied and unique workplaces and environments across the organization is important. I talked a little bit about financial services before. Many of them have had nurses on site at contact centers and trading floors. As the admin functions return, self-screening and social distancing protocols will obviously be a big part of that focus, as Peter will talk about. And then finally, matching the workplace ecosystem to support the end state optimal balance between on-site and at home is important. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes, but suffice to say that businesses don't operate in a vacuum, especially in more high-density urban centers, so we have to think about the ecosystem around the business. So I'll turn it over to Peter to continue on.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And probably at no time in our recent history have we had a situation where the safety of our employees is job one. And, you know, we've always incorporated that into occupational health and safety, talent management, culture development, all extremely important. But probably at no point in our recent history have we had to really consider the health, physical and mental health of the people that we work with in all of our businesses, in all of our geographies, in all of our regions. So it is a bit of a new shift, and there's a certain amount of empowerment that goes along with that, and certainly opportunities for employers to develop a new kind of relationship with employees. Ignoring it would be, extraordinarily perilous for the employer, but leaning into it, doubling down on that is a huge opportunity, and will pay off in spades as this starts to evolve over time. So huge opportunity to really focus on the safety of employees and obviously customers as well. So our two main stakeholders need to be front and center, and they need to see very clear demonstrated commitment to their safety in the go forward, and that's going to be for the foreseeable future. As Andrew said, thinking about not so much what's happening in the next week or month, but think what does your business look like 2 years from now, and then back into a strategy that starts to make sense over the next couple of months, rather than sort of being reactive month after month. Developing a bit of a game plan, a blueprint for the next couple of years would be something that would be really beneficial. The other aspect too is that as we start to engage with our customers and our employees in different ways, we really need to think about forced functions. So their safety needs to be not just about education or just sort of a superficial communication. We really need to engage in a very much boots on the ground kind of perspective, and essentially, we call it sort of forced functions. Like, it's in screening processes, it needs to be something that you can't get to point C unless you've gone through point A and B. And so thinking about our operational safety measures in that way, that it's not just that we're asking, recommending, educating, all good, but we need to really think about safety measures that are basically foolproof, that they really just have to happen in a very logical way. And again, step C can't happen unless step A and step B have actually occurred. The other area that we're sensitizing to now, and we're not seeing it yet, but will become a bit of an issue in the future, is the legal issues that are going to come for employers that don't really embrace some of these safety measures now. And some of those will be around accommodation, especially in a unionized environment. There will be a tremendous pressure to deal with accommodation to the workplace in very innovative ways that we've really never seen before. And not doing that sets up a bit of a legal opportunity that you try and avoid as much as possible, obviously, by being as proactive as possible. As well, when we get into the sort of screening and then testing, and then if there's positives, then tracing at the employer level, not at the population level, there's obviously privacy issues that we need to be highly sensitive to. Some of those privacy issues can result in other security issues even. And so entering into this next phase, one of the things that we're recommending to our corporate clients is to really think about privacy and security, and in a new way as well, moving forward through this idea of how do we do that? How do we do screening appropriately? When tests start to become available in Canada, what kind of tests can we do, or what should we do? What are we going to do with the positives? What are we going to do with the negatives? How do we set up a system that's more automated for tracking those results? And then ultimately for positives, how do we trace back amongst the work colleagues to see if anybody else was placed at risk? So that's another big bucket of work that needs to be considered going forward. And then, of course, something that everybody is doing now, whether they're opening up this week or in the next month, is workspaces, and really rethinking the workspace in a way that makes sense and keeps people safe and still allows the business to flourish. And again, starting to think about, again, that 2-year blueprint. How much of our workforce needs to be on site? How much of the workforce needs to be off site or can work remotely? And we've been forced into dealing with this now during the crisis, but let's leverage our learnings to kind of create a new environment, a new type of business model that hopefully is more efficient for everybody, and supports employees' physical and emotional health as well as we go forward. And the workspaces and those renovations, redistribution of workspaces is just a single point of that. The actual workspace where somebody's located in a typical kind of office setting, relatively easy to modify. Some of the more fixed assets, restaurant, kitchen, commercial kitchens, contact centers where there's IT deliverables that can't be moved as well, or retail functions that can't be moved, customers, dealing with customers on a mass scale. These are all things that need to be embraced, and for the most part, those organizations that have been declared essential over this time period have actually done very, very well, and we're starting to see week to week more and more changes to create environments that are safe for staff and, again, safe for customers. That's a little bit of what's going on now.
Great. I'm going to pick up on the last point around environment and come back to this idea of extending guidance to the workplace ecosystem, in effect, outside of the workplace. And this can be about extending policy guidance. In some cases, it can be around voluntary recommendations to employees as well. And I'll give you a few examples that tend to be fairly relevant to most organizations. Public transportation is the obvious first one, to and from the work site. Considering regulations and guidance from public transit authorities is so critical in terms of how you integrate that into a safe at work system. And obviously that is going to change over the next few phases of the pandemic. That needs to be considered. Building management measures is another common one, and a few specific examples: main floor screening, elevator maximums, delivery service protocols, ensuring that an in-office system of signage syncs with the building signage if relevant. Those are a few common examples of where building management needs to be a consideration in a company's safe at work system. But even beyond the immediate building, if you think about public spaces that employees frequent, be it food courts or otherwise, ensuring that there's an understanding of what safety measures are in place in those spaces is also important. Another example is the intersection between school closures, as Peter mentioned, and the impact on employees' ability to work on site. Certainly through the balance of this school year, that's going to be an important consideration for the next several weeks. And then finally, special consideration to immunosuppressed individuals and those living with them at home is another requirement that employers really need to put some thought to. I'll pause there and let Peter extend to the fourth item.
Yeah. So, and again, as we go forward, the system that we put in place has to be adaptable and flexible, because we might end up, taking 3 steps forward and 1 step backward. We're hearing about a second wave. It's more than a little bit likely, and so any kind of safe at work, return to work, return to office, that kind of process needs to anticipate that things have to be able to change back to a little bit more like they were during a full lockdown, because those public policies will very likely come into being, and we'll have to react to those things very quickly. Clearly, the benefit that we have going into a second or a third wave is that we know how to do this, and our staff are used to it, not liking it, but used to it. So the response will be very, very quick. And hopefully, if there is unfortunately a second wave, hopefully we can really nip it in the bud and stop it at its start, so that it's much less of an impact on the Canadian economy, certainly, and family life, personal life, all of that will be something to be absolutely considered. And again, the likelihood is strong as we start to relax some of our social distancing for a percentage of our population. Again, you know, we're not talking about 95% of people that do exactly what they're told. We're talking about, unfortunately, a minority, sort of a 5% of the population that seems to not take this seriously. And unfortunately, it's just all it takes is that 5% to have the virus spread and return with a vengeance. And so, you know, we're not talking everybody. Most people, they get it. They're doing exactly what they need to do to keep everybody safe. Unfortunately, we do have to have rules in place, and again, some, you know, very strict measures to apply to some people in the population, small percentage that don't seem to take it quite as seriously, and that's the risky point. That's the 5% that's going to end up putting us back into a second wave. So, as we see the nicer weather coming, as we see summer just sort of around the corner, there's going to be a lot of pressure for people to, you know, get out of their homes a bit more, have more social gatherings, get the family together in large numbers, have the big barbecues, and you know, after when people start to get in those situations, you know, slippage can happen, and a little less fastidious around the social distancing, the 2-meter rules and such. So it remains to be seen, but I think the takeaway message is any plan needs to be able to be adapting and very, very quickly to a new landscape, which could be a second or a third wave.
I'll round out the checklist to talk a little bit about communication, and we're treating this as a discrete item, but needless to say, this is integrated in each of the items that we've talked about to date. And a communication strategy is critical during all phases of the return to on-site work to manage expectations of all stakeholders. And stakeholders would include employees, but also the board, customers and partners, suppliers, regulators. It's a long list of interested parties that you need to communicate regularly with and very clearly with, and a robust communications plan to enable that is obviously a must. And the other thing that I would mention around communication is just how important during times of crisis, visual communication plays. So signage, we've talked a little bit about. I'd go further to say video is absolutely critical, especially for memorability and broader health and educational initiatives, mental health being the most notable one, but really covering the spectrum of eat, move, and think, as Medcan says. So that is a little bit on communication, but as I mentioned, it has to be threaded throughout the entire approach. And with that, maybe we can conclude the presentation part of this just to talk a little bit about really what are we trying to do overall here. And Chris, if you can go to the next slide. The Safe at Work system, regardless of what flavor best suits your individual organization, is really all about creating an environment of trust and security for every employee. That's what we're trying to engender here. And in order to do that, this is really about having an evidence-based approach that syncs with the public health authorities and the services that they offer. It's also about being able to offer clinically customized approaches, having a comprehensive assessment of not only individual employees, but the worksite in total. The reporting and the tracking and the closed loop component of this is obviously critical. Peter talked a little bit about that in the context of testing. More broadly around the Safe at Work system, reporting is so important. And then finally, privacy and security of information goes without saying is a critical piece of this as well. So we can include this in a mail out to attendees if they're interested, along with the checklist as a summary. So I'll just conclude there, and I'll turn it back over to Chris if there's any questions we can address.
Thanks, Andrew. So folks, if you do have questions, you can use the, here, I'm just going to change. Okay. You can use the Q&A function at the top of your screens. It actually, depending on how you're viewing this, it may also be at the bottom of your screens, and you just click the Q&A. We did receive some questions by email in advance of the webinar, and so I'm going to walk through some of those. So one of them involved compliance, and I think it's, you know, you can imagine situations with immunocompromised, you know, when you're dealing with either immunocompromised fellow colleagues or with colleagues who have people within their bubble who are also immunocompromised, where special considerations are easy to envision. What if a fellow colleague is not compliant with the workplace measures as discussed? So perhaps, you know, TTC, perhaps they're taking public transit where the team has agreed that they're not. What measures are possible? And I think, Andrew, perhaps you can lead with this one, and then we can hit it over to Peter after that.
Yeah, so there's, I think, a few considerations. Obviously, the system the company agrees to and company policies would be one, but I think there would be broader legal considerations that would come into play here that you'd also have to take into account as well. The companies, Chris, that we've worked with, they've been able to accommodate immunosuppressed individuals with specific policies. So they've been very proactive in thinking that through. And then they've been able to put a process into place whereby if an immunocompromised individual is either, you know, reticent to return to the workplace, they've been able to make accommodations for them. Or in some cases where, in fact, an immunocompromised individual has developed an illness, they've been able to manage those particular situations in specific ways. So those are a few thoughts. Peter, please jump in if you have any additional ones.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think fortunately it's a small enough number of employees in this category, generally speaking, that you can deal with them on an individual basis, which makes things a lot easier, certainly within the purview of a policy framework. But thankfully, you can do an N of one. Like, these are individuals that may be known through the HR or the Occupational Health and Safety Department division of an organization. Hopefully they've self-identified, and that for the most part, organizations have just done whatever it takes to keep those individuals safe and sound. And so it's, thus far at least, everything we've seen has been a strong willingness to deal very proactively with these situations. And it's been just great to work with customers, with our corporate clients that have been willing to, again, kind of lean into this and not shy away at all.
No, that's, and I do think, the Canadian populace has demonstrated a lot of responsibility as it comes to non-compliance. Hasn't necessarily been that issue, and the 5% figure that you cited, I think, Peter, that's I think that's a good number. Okay, we do have so self-screening. Do you have a recommended checklist, and how often is it recommended? Whether it's daily or weekly? Peter, maybe you want to lead with this one.
So self-screening specifically, as frequently as possible, for sure. That's a pretty broad statement to make. But anytime that a person has left a place of employment, and let's say we're talking about somebody who's working on an on-site versus at home, as soon as that person leaves the workplace into the community, there is that risk of being infected, having contaminated any kind of symptoms that could develop. So anytime you move from that environment where you potentially could be infected to coming back on site, the self-screening should be done literally every time that happens, so that it's, again, it becomes part of the process, the natural cadence of getting back to work. And then whether that's more of a passive screening, and then overlaying an active screening process on top of that, moving closer into the to the workplace, critically important. And then an important part of that is from the employer side is having a system in place that you can actually track that you can actually from a reporting perspective, who's off, who's been screened negative, who's been screened positive, and what do we do with that. So I think that the self-screening should be almost an ongoing daily type of occurrence, and that's something that we're getting into the habit of just now.
Thanks, Peter. Andrew, anything to add?
No, I think that covers it well, Chris.
So we have one more question that I think we'll do as we're coming to the end of our time. To ensure that our employees are safe in the workplace, we need to have hand sanitizer and disinfectant wipes available on site. However, we're still unable to access. I do think a lot of people are struggling with this. Any recommendations on where to purchase? Peter, why don't you lead with that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. We don't have an inside track into that at all. It's which is a bit of a mystery to me, because hand sanitizer is relatively simple product, and yet we're really lacking it. We were worried about toilet paper, but that's gone by the wayside. But really, hand sanitizer is one of those things that is in short supply, and so there's no magic to that. I think just like toilet paper initially, masks secondarily, I think hand sanitizer, when there's a demand, somebody's going to create the supply. And so I think as we're seeing the demand, the supply just has to keep up. And again, if there isn't hand sanitizer, the first thing is, before you reach for hand sanitizer, is soap and water. A good washing of the hands with soap and water is equally effective to hand sanitizer. Not quite as convenient, because you have to, find a place where you can actually wash your hands. But in the absence of hand sanitizer, just make the effort, find that place, and wash your hands.
Fantastic. I did want to take a moment to tell people how they can learn more. So I'm sharing my screen right now. This is the medcan.com site. If you scroll down, you can learn more through, we've got information about stay at work, stay at home, and the return to work. If you have further questions, or if you want to talk to somebody about enlisting Medcan, then you can click on the Get in Touch page right there, the link right there. We do Safe at Work system webinars I'm just going to stop sharing this. We do Safe at Work system webinars every Tuesday at 12:30. Peter, you have the next one with Tracy Brower. Did you want to, I think that's going to be an interesting one about employee relations. You said Tracy was wonderful. Do you want to talk about that just for a quick minute, and then we'll wrap up?
Yeah, Chris, it's going to be a great webinar. Oddly enough, so my first degree was actually in medical anthropology before I went into medicine, and I never thought I'd use that content again, the things that I learned. And actually, it's coming into play these days really significantly, as you start to see how sort of the biopsychosocial model in a cultural context is very important these days as to how we respond to the pandemic and the challenges. And Tracy is a world recognized leader in that area as a sociologist. This is a fascinating time to see us as a species, how we react and how we accommodate, how we change behavior, how quickly we can adapt, but how we struggle. As something as simple as handshake. How do we get used to not handshaking? How do we get used not to kissing people on each cheek or giving a hug as a greeting? So simple things like that have just in a heartbeat have left our cultural lexicon. And so Tracy's done quite a bit of work in terms of the sociology of COVID and how does that impact the workplace as well. So looking forward to next Tuesday.
Andrew, can you wrap us up with any final thoughts?
I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. I hope everyone's happy and healthy. And I know there were a few questions we weren't able to address, and we'd be happy to do that via email if you just want to put an inquiry through the website or if you have an email address handy, feel free, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. And just want to say thank you to Chris as well.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Peter. Folks, we do put the archives of these webinars on our YouTube feed. You just go to youtube.com and search for Medcan, and you'll be able to find your way there. We'll also email out to participants the YouTube link, as well as future registration links for future webinars. And that'll be an opportunity also to ask questions in addition if you weren't able to today. So yes, thanks for everyone for joining, and see you next week. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Goodbye for now.